Hi, I'm Frank Mooring. I'm retired senior space editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. And tonight, or this evening, we're going to talk about the next 50 years of human spaceflight, building on the lessons of the past. A half century ago, humans were just beginning to get a visceral feeling for where we are in the universe. We'd gone outside spaceship Earth and started to look around. Everyone had seen the Earthrise and whole Earth pictures, and then Armstrong and Aldrin took their pictures from the Sea of Tranquility. And those photos of that barren surface showed us what a rich treasure our planet is, and it's the only home to life that we've found so far in the past 50 years. It's also demonstrated the possibilities of the future with an infinite number of worlds to explore. Apollo 11 was truly an international triumph celebrated worldwide as an example of what we can do as a species. And today, Spaceship Earth looks pretty much the same as it did when Neil and Buzz peered down from the moon. The forests and the forests and the polar ice caps are getting smaller, the cities are getting larger, and the lights are getting brighter, but it's still the same old planet. 50 years is not geologic time, yet it's a lifetime for us puny humans. Our world has changed in ways few could have imagined when we took that small step into the lunar regolith together. The superpower competition that fueled that space race has ended, and now men and women from across the globe live and work together in Earth orbit, united by the demands of survival in space. Our machines have become smarter, even intelligent, but we still haven't moved humans beyond the small steps of the Apollo missions. So this evening we're going to discuss what it took to get us to the moon, what we've learned, and how we can apply that knowledge to the next 50 years of human spaceflight. How can we settle the moon and move on to Mars and beyond? Your hosts at the 70th International Astronautical Congress have assembled a stellar panel, if you'll pardon the pun, to help us stretch our imaginations across the next human lifetime in the exploration of space. And probably most of you know the panelists, but I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of them. Jan Werner at the far end there is Director General of the European Space Agency. He's been busy all day on the stage, I think. Before he joined ESA in 2015, he was chairman of the executive board of the German Aerospace Center, DLR. He held that post for 8 years. He's a civil engineer, and he came to government from Technical University Darmstadt, which is one of his alma maters, which he led as president from 95 until 2007. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about the concept he's developed with his unique background of the Moon Village, of evolving public and private facilities on the surface of the moon. Next is Lisa Callahan. She's the Vice President and General Manager, Civil Space at Lockheed Martin Space Systems Company. She's the executive in charge of human work in human spaceflight and space science, including the Orion human spacecraft, the Hubble and Spitzer space telescopes, the GOES-R weather satellites, and scientific probes that include InSight, OSIRIS-REx, Juno, MAVEN, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. That's quite a resume. She's an electrical engineer, trained at Virginia Tech. She's also worked in undersea systems, missile defense, and simulation training at Lockheed Martin. Jeff Manber there in the next seat is the founder and CEO of NanoRacks, which has flown more than 700 payloads in space, both with the accommodation hardware it has on the space station and also its deployment gear that has sent some 200 client satellites into orbit. Jeff is a pioneer in entrepreneurial commercial space. I've been covering space for about 40 years until I retired a couple of years ago, and Jeff has been there pretty much the whole time. He was a player in the merger of the U.S. and Russian human spaceflight programs as managing director of Energia USA, and before that as CEO of Mir Corp, which leased and marketed services on the old Soviet space station Mir. He helped set up the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce under President Reagan, and he worked on formation of the first fund devoted to commercial space activities at Shearson Lehman American Express. He's written a lot of stuff, including a book entitled Selling Peace, which is an account of his time working with the Russian space program. George Niels, next, is, until last year, was Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. And in that job, NASA and the Air Force began the transition from the traditional model of spaceflight development that's typified by Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and other aerospace giants to launching and recovering privately developed spacecraft. And his organization worked to ensure public safety in entrepreneurial spaceflight in keeping with the FAA mission, and also to promote its use. And he has more than 35 years of aerospace experience in the public and private sectors. He's a test flight engineering graduate of the Air Force Test Pilot School and a former manager of the Flight Integration Office at NASA's Johnson Space Center. And I should say he's also been very active in helping to organize this panel here this week. Next is Nora Payton. She's the only member of our panel who wasn't born when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And she's representing tonight the generation that's actually going to do some of the stuff that we're talking about. She's a faculty member at the International Space University and a citizen scientist astronaut candidate with Project Possum. She's a project manager at the Irish Composite Center in Limerick and hopes to become the first Irish citizen to fly in space. She's already worked with nanoracks to put Ireland's first student experiment on the ISS. And just recently, she's published a book for children entitled Shooting for the Stars. And finally, Ellen Stofan. Currently, she's the director, let me find the names here, John and Adrian Mars, director of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. I just say she runs the Space Museum. But she was also chief scientist at NASA. She's a planetary geologist. She held the NASA role from 2013 to 2016, and as such played central roles in long-range planning for human missions to Mars and to fostering commercial activity in the ongoing transition from the space station to outposts on the moon and beyond. Let's see, she joined the Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a postdoctoral fellow, serving as deputy chief scientist on the Magellan mission to Venus and chief scientist on the New Millennium effort to develop new technologies for space science. She's also co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Future of Space Technologies at Davos. So she's spent a lot of time looking both into the future of spaceflight and preserving and displaying and curating the artifacts of its past. So let's thank our panelists for taking the time tonight. And I'd like to start with Jan Werner. You're known for the concept of the Moon Village, a multi-party outpost. It evolves organically with many players as they add human and robotic components to it. And I know you're continuing to develop that concept as you go along. Can you give us an idea of how you see that approach relatively near term, taking root on the moon, probably at the South Pole, and then expand it on beyond that into the next 50 years, deeper into the solar system and perhaps to Mars?
Thank you very much. I have to say I did not understand the question fully because the acoustics is not the best. You see, you have the same problem. That's exactly what I mean, but I got more or less what you ask. So the next 50 years in human spaceflight and especially to the moon, we have to look back and we need some consideration what was good and what was bad. So, and I thought when I was reading, you see I was born in '54, so I really followed all the different space missions from Sputnik, of course, to Apollo 11, but also the others, also later on Apollo Soyuz and Shuttle and etc. And when you look to Apollo 11, it was not only Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins, but they also brought special a special metal shield, where you had something written on. And the words what was saying is, "We came in peace for all mankind." This sounds excellent, but for me there is something missing. And this is, for me it would be better, we come in peace with all mankind. So this tiny change, that would make a big difference. And that was the idea of the Moon Village concept. By the way, the word Moon Village is not an invention from me, it's an invention from an American journalist with whom I discussed at the National Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, and he said, "What you are saying, it sounds like a village." And that was the idea, and therefore let's have a look back. What is a village? A village is something where different people are joining and saying, "Oh, this is a nice place. Here we can have our homes. Here we can have a bar and maybe an undertaker, whatever you need in addition." So this is what is a village. So different interests, different people, but same location. And this is the only common with Moon Village. Different ideas, different actors, different methods, but same location. All the other things which came afterwards were not the main idea of this Moon Village. So for instance, I got also emails, people are asking they want to be the mayor of this village and all of this. This was not what I meant. It was really the different ideas, the different concepts, the different possibilities, but one location. So, and therefore I called it later on multi-partner open concept, which is as a narrative much too complicated, but which explains much better what is meant. That means that there are partners from different countries, from different institutions, public or private, and they bring together what they can do and on the surface of the moon. And that means for me the future is really, and this is already now starting, so I always get the question, when is this project of ESA starting? That's not the question. It is running already all the time, because since years now there is a new investigation and new idea to go to the moon, and totally different to what happened 50 years ago. It is in a global open discussion. And there are companies saying we would like to have a rover on the surface of the moon. Others are saying we can transport you to the moon. Another company is saying, what about the energy on the surface of the moon? So this is exactly the role of this concept, multi-partner open concept, and it needs, as on Earth, something like a broker. And so, therefore, I always said ESA is ready not to take a lead. There is no lead for this necessary, but to play the broker. And therefore, we collected worldwide more than 70 interests from different organizations and brought them together and say, okay, here you are looking for a launcher, here you have a transportation company. You are looking for something on the surface, here we can offer you this relation. And therefore I think this is really something we should look into the future. The moon is not owned by one or the other country or one or the other organization. It is there. We need the moon for the Earth, of course. This is for our dynamic, for our orbiting. And therefore, I believe the Moon Village is something which is right now existing, and therefore, I'm more than happy.
And beyond the moon?
And what?
Beyond the moon?
Yes, there was also... so what I have to say at this point, and maybe I lose a lot of friends, I'm against colonization. I'm against colonization of the moon. I'm against colonization of Mars. Why that? Because colonization means you are moving away people from Earth for the rest of their life, or maybe even for generations, on the moon or on Mars. And neither moon nor Mars are nice places. This is number one. You have to live in a can. This is number one, which I think is not so pleasant, and Big Brother is watching you, is not really nice over there. That's number one. But number two is for me even stronger argument. I heard that even scientists were saying, we are destroying our Earth, therefore we have to look for another location. We should go to Mars or Moon and have to live over there. This is a very bad excuse for not taking care of our Earth. And therefore, I'm strongly against colonization of Mars and Moon. Who knows, maybe in some 100 years we find another nice planet where it's nice to live, but not on Mars and not on Moon and not on Venus and not on Mercury and so on and so on. The Earth is the best place in this solar system, I'm sure.
Ellen, I saw you shaking your head. What?
No, I completely agree on the last point. I avoid the word colonization, first of all, because it's actually a very fraught word that we try to avoid. But I think the idea of having anything other than sort of scientific outposts, maybe on the moon some economic outposts, the idea of wholesale moving people, and there is no planet B. You know, if anything, our exploration of the solar system has told us that this is the habitable planet, and this is where we, as Carl Sagan put it so much more eloquently than I ever could, this is where we make our stand. And don't use the other planets as an excuse not to do job one, which is to take care of this planet.
But of course, to go there, to go to the moon, to go to Mars, this is in our DNA. That's curiosity, and also to develop something over there, to make whatever, but not as a permanent move of people, of whatever, to stay there forever. I think this is not a nice option.
Permanent outposts.
One more question for you, and this was something that came up a lot at the heads of agency session earlier, and that's the question of China. Without the issue of why they weren't participating in heads of agency this year, what do you, based on your experience as an agency leader, see as the long-term prospects for them for China playing a truly collaborative role in the exploration of space?
This question, of course, has several sides. I say very simply, I am in favor of cooperation with all countries around the globe. And I'm in favor even in cases when we do not share human rights or ethics or moral or whatever. Even then, I'm in favor of cooperating. Why? Because if you're isolating, then you have no interaction any longer. So it's much better if we are convinced, and I'm of course convinced that my values are the best, that otherwise you should change your values. So therefore it's much better to cooperate, to work together, and maybe by that changing the other partner. So I'm not looking just to one country right now. You ask me for one country, but I'm saying it in general terms. And that's for me the better logic than to say because the other one has a different thinking about this or that subject, I keep him away or keep her away. So concerning China, ESA is working together with China. We are doing scientific missions. We don't do everything with China, but we are doing scientific missions. We also had some training of our astronauts in China. We do not have a concrete plan to have together space flights or whatever, but science is a good instrument to bridge earthly crisis, and space science even better. And therefore, we believe, and we do so, that cooperation with China is also important. And by the way, we have a big advantage because we are not dependent directly from one government. I have 22 governments, so if one government has an issue, I have still 21 who have no issue, so therefore it's easier for us than for others.
Thank you. Lisa Callahan, to date the United States and its international partners have spent about $25 billion on the Space Launch System and which Boeing is building, and Lockheed Martin's Orion human spaceflight capsule, plus another $4.7 billion that was spent on Orion during Constellation, which would have used a different rocket. It's an older program. I'm interested to know how you see traditional companies like Lockheed Martin working with spaceflight newcomers, international partners, new international partners, to reduce the high cost of traditionally organized space exploration, and also to maybe hasten it a little bit, make it go faster.
Yeah, so I would start by saying that we work with a lot of different companies, even on Orion. 60% of the program dollars go to suppliers, And of that 60%, 30% of them are small businesses. So they may be startups, they may be smaller companies that are working to support Orion as well. And we do a lot of partnership. My colleague here to the left, Jeff, we work with him as well in terms of looking at how we can bring on startup companies and others as well. So we definitely branch out, and I would argue to do all of the things that Jan just talked about, we have to be working in partnership with new commercial companies, with international suppliers. Jan's team provides us with the European service module as a part of Orion. And so that's been a great relationship, and you did get all 22 of your member countries to agree to that. So that's great as well. We also make investments. So Lockheed Martin has a Lockheed Martin Ventures organization. We invest $200 million a year in startup companies, looking at key technologies that we think can help take technologies to the next level. And we're using commercial technologies to improve and reduce cost even on Orion. So we have a digital model of Orion. We have been using AR technology on the floor in our manufacturing facility, where our technicians can see through goggles their work instructions. They can identify where they should be putting tabs on the systems for running cables and other things, and we've seen a 90% cost savings in the labor it takes to do that just by using digital technology as a part of our Orion production. So we're reaching out across to partner with whoever is willing to partner with us, and we're using it to the benefit of reducing cost and innovation in the systems that we're developing.
I know your organization has done a lot of work in spaceflight architecture from here to Mars. And just one near-term kind of question, if you could please discuss what you have learned as the pros and cons of a direct descent to the lunar surface versus using a gateway.
Well, you know, we've explored the architectures for exploration, not only around the lunar surface, but also around Mars. And you'll recall at IAC in Guadalajara, if you were there, we rolled out our Mars base camp concept, which was basically putting a base camp or a lunar orbiting, or in this case, a Martian orbiting platform around Mars. And the same concept in that time was true, that we wanted to do that around the moon first to practice and be able to look at the ConOps for all of that. So we believe having an orbiting platform or a system around on the lunar surface, like a gateway, enables you to get to all different parts of the lunar surface. And one thing that I'm not sure is always clear to people is they think about the International Space Station as you know, a fixed asset, and LEO. The gateway is actually mobile. We can actually move it into different orbits and into different places around the moon. And so it allows you to actually access that very effectively. In addition to that, it's a great launch point, as we talked about going deeper into space, because you are already outside of the Earth's gravity well, and you can launch onto that to go to Mars or to other places within our solar system. So, and then lastly, we're going to be leveraging robotic vehicles as well as human vehicles, and so to be able to operate them in close proximity to the surface that you would like to go explore, you can actually have humans in the loop with those robotic vehicles and really gain great science and have the humans choosing which rocks they want to pick up off the surface when they're in close proximity. And then they can come back to that gateway and actually do the science they want to do there without having to go all the way back down to Earth. So I think it will just save us a tremendous amount of time as well to have that kind of a gateway and science exploratory there.
How long do you think it would take to have that Mars base that you showed at Guadalajara up there?
Well, our plan was always to start at the moon. As I said, we really need to learn how to operate outside of low Earth orbit and outside of you know, direct communications where there's going to be delays and other things. So we always wanted to practice at the moon. The landing systems that we would build for the moon are not too unlike the landing systems that we would need for Mars. And so it's also a way to test out those systems and the capabilities that we'd need when we're just 3 days away to get our astronauts back to Earth rather than 6 months away from getting back to Earth. So I think we need to do the work that we're doing at the moon first and then move on to Mars. So in the 1930s, we're ready to go.
Thank you. Jeff Mamber, you've been doing this for a long time, the entrepreneurial end of the commercial.
It never gets boring.
Pardon me?
Never gets boring.
No. This is a lessons learned question. You've probably had a lot of ups and downs along the way, I'm sure you have. What kind of advice would you give to space entrepreneurs in, say, Nora's generation as they spend the next 50 years doing what you've been doing for the past 30 or so?
Well, I mean, the first thing is the whole term, space entrepreneurs. I don't think that existed 20 years ago. And so it's remarkable. People in our office at NanoRacks, they take a lot of this for granted. That we have government as customer, that we can self-finance projects, that we have customers from around the world. So the first thing I suppose I'd say to a space entrepreneur is, yes, the market has developed enough that you can be an entrepreneur. And I would also say, keep in mind, it may be bewildering at times, but space is not the final frontier. It's our frontier. And much of the laws of your country, whichever country that is, on how by laws I mean the style, the regime, the customs, of how you develop a business, will apply to space now as well. And so, there once was a Mr. Boeing, there was once, a Mr. Grumman, and they in America had government support, and the government was a customer for aviation, and it slowly developed up. And so there's nothing too magical about this time. The wonderful part of it is a developing market now. We are at that tipping point, and you can be an entrepreneur. And so you knock your head against the wall and you go forward. So the advice I would give is this is becoming a business, a normal place to do business, as lovely and fantastic it is for all of us in this room, but it is becoming a legitimate business now, and you can be a legitimate entrepreneur.
You and I have talked in the past about the pot of gold in space, and I know you explore the Earth on jet planes all the time to find new business opportunities. Earlier today we heard Jim Bridenstine from NASA say he expects some kind of breakthrough in terms of another commercial application on the space station in the next, he said, 3 to 7 years. I just wonder if you could maybe give us a short list of some of the potential pots of gold that you've come across in your explorations.
Well, I'll say, Frank, that the phrase pots of gold kind of rubs me a little bit. It's like colonization or something. It has, by its very nature, a sort of negative. I prefer to say, what rewarding opportunities exist out there. And so, but to be serious, I think this is a wonderful moment. I can remember in the late 80s and 90s, NASA promising almost we would discover the cure for cancer. That was the whole, raison d'etre for the space station, and it just wasn't going to happen. The technology wasn't there. We went to the space shuttle. We just could not get it together to have that 24/7 quality research. I think we're close to that now. I honestly believe now with a number of markets, whether in space, 3D printing and what we see that can bring, and using the harsh environment of space for developing new agricultural technology, products, seedlings, microbes, bacteria, looking at using the environment of space to green the deserts. I think we're close to that. I think we're close to having automated laboratories. At NanoRacks, we're working on that now, and we see the idea that the next decade is one where we develop the interchange between how we run the labs today on station and how we run the labs of tomorrow. So I do share with the administrator that at long last, I think we'll be learning and hearing about more breakthroughs taking place in the microgravity environment. And the wonderful thing is not only will it be about looking out at exploration to help as our voyagers go further out, but it will be also to make life more comfortable here on Earth. And I think we have to hit that balance.
Thanks, Jeff. George Neild, you spent a good portion of your career both making private space flight in various forms safer and also promoting it. My wife told me not to ask too many lessons learned questions, but from a public sector standpoint, what are things that governments can do and should not do to support the generic expansion of human spaceflight?
I think it's important to start by recognizing that we are in the middle of a very significant transformation in terms of how we do space operations, from a time in which just about everything that happened in space was by governments to a time in which private industry is playing an increasingly important role. Now, that does not mean that government doesn't have a big role to play in the future. But I think its role needs to change over time, whereas historically, governments and government space agencies would be responsible for designing and building and operating launch vehicles and spacecraft. I think now there's a different set of responsibilities that could help to grow that global space economy. And I can think of several, and I'm sure there are many more. First would be the governments could define a strategic vision and propose long-term goals. Second, establish supportive policies, laws, and regulatory frameworks. Third would be developing the needed space-related infrastructure, both on the ground and in space. Fourth would be maturing needed technologies through research and development. And then fifth, building partnerships between government, industry, academia, and with the international community. So it's sort of a different way of operating than governments have traditionally done in the past.
Thank you. If we could push this a little bit further into the future, Jan, you talked about a broker sort of coordinating, I guess, activities on a lunar village, a moon village. How can the kinds of concerns that George has been talking about be balanced with the needs for sort of a natural evolution of human expansion into space? I'm trying to get this as clear as I can. The broker idea, is it top down? Is it bottom up? Where does the control or the guidance come from?
So first of all, I believe that the agencies, so we heard from George, what the agencies are doing is changing. This is obvious. And that means the agency has to understand that and change, which is not so easy. I can tell you, also in ESA, when I'm saying to the ESA staff what I believe, how we have to change, that sometimes they believe that I'm really against ESA, because they say, but we have 50 years of excellent experience, so why to change? It was good for the last 50 years, it should be good for the next 50 years. And I don't believe that this is the right understanding. So it was fine, and this traditional working as a space agency will still be needed in the future for some missions. I mentioned this morning one, I mentioned it again, Aeolus, a satellite which is measuring the wind speed from space. If you do this directly and give it to industry and say, okay, you get a bunch of money and do it, this mission would never be successful, because it took us, I think, 15 years to solve the technical problems. And this is a typical work and where the public organizations are necessary. And that, I believe, also for exploration and science, we need the public organizations. Other areas might shift, like Earth observation is already shifting towards private. But what I believe is that the agencies should look into and see what can they deliver. So we can deliver the traditional project management. We still can, and we will do. We can be partner of industry and having a public-private partnership where both are investing, sharing risks, sharing investments. This is another way. The next one is where we ask industry, and this is what is also here in the US done regularly, where the public side is buying something, a service, a full service. And then the last role, and this is what I explained this morning as well, is a broker function, where the agency tries just to, because an agency has a global network, so they can use this to bring together actors of different size, of different nature, or whatever. So this is not top-down, bottom-up, it's just like a broker if you buy a house. It's an interlocutor. It's somebody who has some information and is ready to share this information without additional money for that. Just to tell you, so I'm not asking for money for that. But I think this is an important role we can play, and therefore I think that the broker function is something also, what George mentioned, which is necessary. We should do that. We should be able to do it.
Just to add on to that a little bit, I think we are learning now that there can be some significant advantages to having a more active private sector involvement in programs. We're seeing examples where it can be lower cost, it can have increased innovation, there can be maybe a greater risk tolerance than a government agency would typically have. Companies are motivated to look for new products and services and customers and markets in a way that the government just doesn't do. And new sources of funding and investment are also things that the private sector can do that governments typically do not do. So picking up on what Jan was saying, I kind of like the idea of thinking about this as more of a bottoms-up type approach, where in the future we move from having programs that have schedules and budgets and a lead space agency, and we work towards the establishment of a robust and thriving global space economy in which all are welcome to participate.
George talked a little bit about government supplying infrastructure, hard technologies, new technologies, and of course those things are expensive. I wonder for the business people on the panel, where is the line? I mean, how far can the private sector go with things like building a vehicle assembly building or developing a new propulsion technology or something like that?
You know, one of the things I've thought about a bit is, I think the government, if you look at almost everything that has turned into a thriving commercial industry, the government played a role in the beginning. They built the infrastructure and they built the first, they proved out the capabilities and the technologies. And it wasn't until then, when it became more mainstream, that commercial industry really flourished in that. And so I think you see even in NASA today with their international partners, they're really looking to build the infrastructure to transport people and cargo to space, with the hope that there's going to be this flourishing commercial market that's going to grow out of that. But even the commercial companies today are still using that infrastructure on the ground in which to get their vehicles and their products into space. So I think you have to get to that tipping point where it becomes more mainstream, the cost can come down to an affordable level, and then you'll see it flourish more. The other thing that I think the government really needs to understand and decide is what's critical to them to own, and what is it that they're willing to buy from this thriving commercial industry. And in some cases, there may be elements of the space architecture that the government would like to continue to own so that they have some level of control over that, some level of consistency, and it's dependable to them. Because the commercial markets will change. Tomorrow they may decide not to sell something that they're selling today, and if that's their only means to ferry astronauts to a particular location, they're starting with nothing again. So I do think when you think about this exploration architecture and where we want to go and push forward, we need to think about what are the elements that the US government or international governments would like to own, and what are the pieces that they're going to readily buy from industry. I worked in the training and simulation business. When I started in that business, the government built 3D image generation systems. They were huge racks of hardware, and they own that technology. In the 90s, the commercial industry totally eclipsed that. You can now do 3D rendering on, your iPhone. When that happened, the government could take advantage of that commercial industry, and then they built on top of it. They needed their 3D environments to be able to change. They needed to be able to build buildings on them and have that be in their simulations. So they added the extra value on top of what was readily available in the commercial market. That's the tipping point that I think we'll have to see in space before everything really takes off and they can move to a different level.
Jeff?
I'm most excited about the way we're beginning to look not at any one piece of hardware, but at the ecosystem. And as you begin to think about an ecosystem, well, it's how do we create with the government, as Lisa says, we create the basic infrastructure, and then how does the private sector take that and leverage that taxpayer investment? And we're beginning to see an ecosystem in low Earth orbit, which is really exciting. And so we depend on the investment made by governments on the International Space Station, and then we in the private sector are taking that and adding to it, and that's how you get a real in-space ecosystem going. That's how you get a marketplace.
Thank you. Nora Payton, your generation is going to be actually executing a lot of the things we're talking about tonight. You're also going to be living on planet Earth during the next 50 years. And there are certainly challenges there: population, climate, a lot of issues that are really threatening to people of your age, I think. Can you help us understand how you see human spaceflight in particular, although spaceflight in general, helping to mitigate some of the terrestrial problems that you're going to face in the next 50 years?
Yeah, sure. I think what's very clear, actually, from listening to the heads of agencies today and the opening session this morning, is that the foundations for the next 50 years are certainly evolving. I think there's a number of layers, I think, to the answer to the question. Our generation certainly wants to keep moving forward, keep pushing boundaries, keep exploring space, certainly get back to the moon and Mars, and keep advancing technologies. I think as well, from talking to my peers and colleagues at Project Possum and also at the International Space University, there's an ownership on us to use all of that to benefit people here on Earth as much as we possibly can. And I think Project Possum is actually a really good example, I think, of how that might be possible. Climate change has come up a number of times today in different conversations. At Project Possum, the science that they're focused on is the upper mesosphere, specifically noctilucent clouds, which are linked with the changing climate that we're in. And over the past number of decades, these clouds have been more visible, and they're increasing in intensity. And the climate change issue that we're facing is the biggest issue that this generation and next will face. And so there's a number of things that we see out of that. So for global problems, we need global solutions. And I think Possum is a really nice example of a very international base of people coming together, including emerging space nations, non-spacefaring nations as well. But it also gives us a chance to communicate that back to our local communities and national communities in terms of why this research is important. So by using suborbital spaceflight to actually measure these clouds, we can then communicate that back to communities at home. So yeah, I think there's a number of ways we can do it, as the panelists had said earlier also today, how we can use Earth observation to show the impact of the changing climate that has. So I think there's a number of layers of how we can use space to benefit people here on Earth.
You know, I've been reading a little bit of your press in Ireland, and you've gotten a lot with your objective of being the first Irish person in space. First, could you tell us a little bit more about Project Possum, and then a little bit more about other countries that might be realizing that they can play a role as well?
Yeah, sure. So Possum it's a non-profit organization, and we are citizen scientist astronaut candidates with them, and it's an amazing opportunity. You know, there's people very international base of people that participate in it, and I think this whole merger of you know, the commercial companies getting much more involved in space has really opened up opportunities that simply weren't there 5-10 years ago. So with Possum, they work with a commercial spacesuit manufacturer, Final Frontier Design, and we get to test that suit out and put it on and try it out. And you know, all of those things that we get to do on the program, we're able to bring back to our local communities. And even I can say the impact that that's had in Ireland has been massive. So yeah, so in terms of, you know, the countries that are involved, there's many different countries involved, and we've also been very privileged to be able to run programs with Possum, including the Possum 13, named after the Mercury 13 astronauts, to look at, you know, or members of society that wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity to get involved. So we've been able to run different programs with Possum to actually reach out to communities and get them involved in designing experiments that have just recently flown on a parabolic flight at the National Research Council in Canada. And there was actually a student from Colombia who flew that experiment on the flight, which is just amazing. You know, these opportunities don't ordinarily happen. So I think it's been an amazing, I suppose, decade, even when you see how things have evolved. So I know that from talking to the other Possum candidates and, you know, my peers and network at ISU, we're all very excited, I suppose, to see what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, but people do certainly want a seat at the table, and they want to be able to access these different things and really get involved.
Thank you. Ellen, Nora's been talking about science and suborbital space. As a distinguished space scientist with a broad range of experience, what do you see as the role of scientific inquiry in future human spaceflight, or vice versa?
Well, I think that science that can be done with human exploration is really critical. And to me, one of the two most exciting areas where I think we're going to see the most development over the next several decades is, first of all, in the search for life beyond Earth. When you look at Mars and you know that the conditions on early Mars were similar to those when life evolved here on Earth, a lot of scientists, including me, think that the chance that life evolved on Mars is fairly high. Now, that life, obviously, when the conditions on Mars became harsh, either had to go underground or went extinct. So finding evidence of past microbial life on Mars is going to be hard. I think that's going to take humans, because you just don't want one sample and say, okay, here's one piece of evidence of life. You want to know to what extent did that life evolve, how ubiquitous was it. That's going to take bases on Mars, it's going to take people, it's going to take a lot of work. And I think it's going to happen. I think it's incredibly exciting, and we're really on the verge of this major discovery, which I think has huge implications for understanding not just life on this planet, not just life in our solar system, but life on these thousands of exoplanets that we've discovered and that really make us think there might be other Earth-like or habitable planets out there. So that's one area that I think humans play a critical role as we go forward. The second area is an area that I think really does come back to this issue of what we do in space with humans every day up on the International Space Station benefits us here on Earth. And that is, as we go out to the Gateway, as we go out to the moon and beyond, we're putting humans out into this two types of radiation environment that is obviously not great for humans. On the other hand, understanding DNA repair mechanisms, I don't think we're certainly coming anywhere close to saying we're promising a cure for cancer, but as we go out and understand more and more, be able to put tissue samples, for example, out at a gateway station or on robotic platforms that are beyond low Earth orbit out into the radiation environment out in deep space, we're going to be able to really start to understand, I think, much better why some people have better DNA repairs than the rest of us. This helps it helps us send astronauts safely into deep space, but it helps humans right here on Earth. And I think if you look at almost every aspect of the research that goes up on the space station, Jeff mentioned agriculture, you see that. It benefits us to understand how to live sustainably in space, and it benefits us to understand how to live sustainably here on Earth.
Thank you. There's a question on the screen here from one of the members of the audience, and if there's a Slido.com, by now you probably know about this, but if you want to put a question up here, go there, and it's at IAC 2019. The question is, how do we foster not only women in space leadership, and we have 3 women in space leadership right here, but also people of color and people from developing nations? I think Nora touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a critical question, and we know from extensive research that diverse teams perform better than non-diverse teams. So to me, this is actually an imperative that we get more people of color, more white women into leadership positions. And obviously, I think a lot of us felt the frustration. It was hugely wonderful to see 2 women walking in space together last week. But the frustration of why it took from 1984 until 2019 to see that happen is frankly frustrating. You know, it's a pipeline problem. We all know that, and it has to be addressed in a pipeline manner. At the Air and Space Museum, we focus on how do we tell stories of all people who have been involved in space exploration to show that people who look like you, this is something that everyone can and should be inspiring. So you have to start at early age, inspire kids, have them understand that people who look like them can accomplish great things, and then it goes all the way to the educational systems, to the workplace, and Jan has been a huge proponent of diversity.
Maybe I say a word. So leaders can do a lot by a very simple approach, and that is changing the vacancy notes. If you have a vacancy note and you write into the vacancy note all the requirements you have, then women normally go through the list and check whether they really can do this or not.
All of them.
All of them. Men read the title and then go down where to send the application to. So therefore, and this is serious, so therefore this can be done. There is, I don't know why, but this is in the society, it's developed like that. So this is something where I can say we can do a lot and also give, of course, then women the opportunity to develop very quickly in an organization. And with all these stupid arguments, I will not even say them over here because then somebody will take it up. There are always arguments to say, no, it's not possible here, not possible there, all bullshit. So, okay, I will not even mention it because then somebody would copy it.
Thank you.
I think both Jan and Ellen have said a lot of that, right? And then once you bring women or people of color into your organization, you have to create an environment where they feel welcome, where they feel like their voices are heard, where they can look around and see others that are like them, whether that's through employee resource groups or other things where they can bond together and see that they're not alone. That's critically important. But we're talking about human spaceflight, and there is nothing more inspiring than getting the next generation, whether it's women, men, people of color, than human spaceflight. And so we need to keep exploring, and we need to keep that moving forward, because that will inspire the next generation to get into math and science and either want to be an astronaut or want to be an engineer that's going to build the next system that's going to go into space.
Thank you, Lisa. There's another question here which kind of matches one I had for George for a little bit later. We're talking about positive things in space, but there are also potential hindrances to the kind of activities we're discussing here today. There's a question on the screen. How can we ensure, wait a minute, where'd it go? The U.S. wants to use space exploration as a show of leadership. How will they react to increased presence in the space sector by other nations challenging that? And then for George, maybe a little bit more general, how can sovereign governments balance their national security interests with what I'll call the soft power opportunities of international civil space cooperation, as on the International Space Station, which we've heard a lot about today as well?
So I think we've shown that it is possible to segment our foreign policy and compartmentalize it, if you will, and successfully partner with not only our friends, our competitors, but our adversaries. And so that's certainly a start. I frankly believe that as we see additional commercial activity, that's going to help as well, because by the time you see companies launching people and cargo to and from low Earth orbit, when you see commercial space stations, when you see satellite servicing, when you see on-orbit propellant depots, when you see solar power stations, when you see space tugs, when you see commercial moon bases, it won't even be so much which nation is doing this. It's going to be, yes, there's a global space economy, and who do I get that product and service from? How can we work together in those kinds of environments?
I think nobody can ask for being leader just by saying that. So say, I have to be the leader all the time. This is not really a solution. So there is competition, and the competition is between countries maybe, but also between institutions, companies, etc. So therefore, I think my answer to this question would just be, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. And then you are a leader. If you believe you can just be leader by waiting, that doesn't work.
If I may, I think one of the most exciting developments in the last few years is that there is there is not one nation now going into space. Never mind the model of European Space Agency, but we just opened an office in the UAE. They just had the exciting Emirates mission to the International Space Station. A completely different range of issues. It's just lovely to hear them looking 50 years out, and how they're going to be using, not to speak for them, but to be use the space program to excite their generation and to not be dependent on oil revenue. And so we see a multiplicity of nations, but they went commercially. And it's really exciting to see that. So I'm hopeful that it will get more crowded. There will be more nations, but it will also be commercial, and it will be for the very reason of the competitiveness that space inspires the next generation, and that keeps you competitive on Earth.
Thank you. I'm not going to ask this question, but I think you can see the question next time we arrive at a new celestial body. I would refer you to it if you haven't read it already. A question, and this is also a potential hindrance to the kind of human spaceflight we're talking about. How can we ensure that, given the rise of mega constellations and the increase in danger of orbital debris collision, we still have access to space? And I think that's a question maybe for Lisa, maybe Jan.
That's a special question for me, because I'm going to the ministerial in about 5 weeks, having a proposal for space safety, including active space debris removal. That means I have a proposal where we have a mission to go into space to catch ESA own space asset and bring it down. And at the same time, we have in this mission also some active system included, which should remove a part of this launcher already directly after launch. So we have debris avoidance and debris removal at the same time. But we need some regulation for the future for that part, so that not there is more debris in space. And also we need a regulation that, for instance, if we go now to a satellite which is not any longer working, if ESA goes to a America-owned satellite, which is really not operative any longer, and bring it down, then in the moment we scrap it, the responsibility, liability is fully with us, and this has to be changed. If we are trying to clean up the orbit, then this is a good action, and it should be also not penalized.
Thank you.
This is something actually that the World Economic Forum Council on the Future of Space Technology is something that that group has been working on for the last several years, because it's not just governments. The problem is there's a lot of private sector companies putting up an awful lot of satellites, and you really need to start having those companies have a code of behavior which helps them say, this is responsible behavior, this is not, and have there be consequences for that.
George, is there a regulatory way to tackle that you maybe weren't able to put together when you were in office?
So I know there are a lot of space lawyers here today, and they might immediately think about, well, we need a new or a modified treaty. The problem is that can take a long time. So as I've been talking to others about this, I think the best way is probably to find a coalition of the willing, if you will, and on a bilateral basis saying, it's okay if you choose to take a piece of my non-functioning satellite out of orbit, and I'm not going to complain or criticize that, and we can do the same for you, and so forth. So that might be the way that we build up some trust and start attacking the technology as well as the policy challenges associated with that type of a situation.
Okay, we're almost out of time. This is an interesting question. Is human spaceflight necessary for space development? And then I have a follow-up for Alan. So who wants to take that one?
This discussion is as old as human spaceflight. And I always say when I get this question from politicians, I say, how to measure the blood pressure of a robot. That's very easy. So you can do things with humans you can't do with robots. All this research at the humans itself, it's for sure something where you need humans. And of course also humans can still do some things better in space than just machines. But this might change in the future with artificial intelligence and all of this. But still, all these medical investigations which are done with osteoporosis, blood pressure, salt regulation, immune system, cancer, etc., this is something where humans are really, you cannot substitute them.
This is a little bit different approach to what Jan just said, but why do humans need to explore space? What's there for us?
I think you're right, Jan. To some extent, I do honestly believe it's in our DNA to go explore, and I think there is that inspirational piece of space exploration that I think, as Eric Stallmer mentioned, when we projected the Saturn V rocket on the Washington Monument this summer, the reason for that was to really try to recapture that inspirational moment when every kid in this country realized that not only was the sky no longer the limit, the moon was no longer the limit. And that inspirational piece, I think, is important. But I also think when you look at rovers on Mars and how long it's taken them to go a couple kilometers versus what a human could do in that same amount of time, humans are flexible, we're creative, we can do a lot more. And I think it's more about humans and robots working together, not humans versus robots.
And think about the technology that we're going to have to invent to take humans into space and what that could do for us back here on Earth.
Anyone else?
Well, one other thought, in the next 12 months, almost certainly we will see at least 2 companies take people up to the edge of space and back down on a commercial basis, selling tickets. And so it's no longer a question to government. Should we be doing this? It's, if you want to go, you can go.
Nora, you may be one of those people. What do you say about why we need to go?
I hope I'm one of those people. Yeah, it's interesting when I read that. I think, is human space flight necessary for space development? But it's not even really space development. It's all development. And I think that's why it is so important that humans have that experience of going to space so they can understand where we actually sit in this whole ecosystem of Earth and tell people about it, because we really need to start looking after Earth better, and I think space provides a really unique platform to do that.
Anyone else? Well, we've run out of time. I really appreciate the panel, and I hope you do too.